The giant crystal towers of Vorth Prime stretched into the purple sky, their surfaces gleaming like deadly jewels. Inside the highest tower, the Vorthak Empire's War Council was having what they thought would be their most entertaining meeting in decades. Admiral Kai slithered into the chamber, his scaled body moving with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. Behind him, holographic displays showed star maps dotted with thousands of conquered worlds. Each red dot represented another species that had learned to bow before Vorthak superiority. Today they were discussing their next target, a small, blue planet called Earth. "Show them the footage again," Kai hissed to his aide, barely containing his amusement. The room's central display flickered to life, showing grainy surveillance footage from the edge of human space. A human warship hung motionless in the void, its hull painted with primitive markings that the Vorthaks found laughably crude. Suddenly, the ship began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot stone. Then it simply disappeared. The assembled Vorthak commanders erupted in clicking laughter, the sound echoing off the crystal walls like breaking glass. 1 second later, the human ship reappeared, but now it was spinning wildly out of control. Sparks flew from its damaged hull, and the Vorthaks could see tiny human figures being ejected into space through hull breaches. "They call it quantum displacement," Kai announced, his voice dripping with mockery. "Their scientists believe they can move matter instantly across space. What they've actually created is the most expensive way to commit suicide ever devised." General Vexra, whose bio-armor still bore scars from the conquest of the Centauri colonies, leaned forward with interest. "How many of these test flights have we observed?" 47 attempts in the past month," replied the intelligence officer. 31 resulted in complete destruction of the test vessel. The remaining 16 suffered catastrophic damage. With total crew loss, not a single successful transportation has been recorded. The laughter grew louder. Some commanders were actually wiping tears from their multifaceted eyes. The idea that these primitive mammals thought they could master technology that even the mighty Vorthak Empire had deemed impossible was beyond amusing. It was pathetic. Emperor Vextar himself materialized in the chamber, his ancient form supported by a hovering throne that hummed with barely contained energy. At over 800 years old, he had personally overseen the conquest of more than 300 worlds. His presence immediately silenced the room. "My loyal servants," his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Today we discuss the humans. I trust you find their efforts entertaining." "Indeed, my emperor," Kai bowed deeply. "Their desperation has reached new heights. They seem to believe that this quantum displacement will somehow save them from their inevitable fate." Vextar's eyes glowed with predatory satisfaction. "Excellent. Fear makes prey animals do foolish things. How stands our third fleet?" 2,000 vessels strong, my emperor. Bioships bred for maximum destruction, phase shift capable, and equipped with the latest plasma cannons. Our projected timeline for complete human subjugation is 12 standard weeks. The emperor's approval rumbled through the chamber. "Make it 8 weeks. I grow tired of watching these mammals struggle. Their resources will serve the empire well, and their surviving population will make adequate slaves for our mining operations." On the displays around them, more footage played of human quantum displacement attempts. Ship after ship flickered out of existence, only to reappear as twisted wreckage or not at all. The Vorthak intelligence networks had been monitoring these tests for months, and the pattern was always the same: spectacular failure, followed by death. What made it even more amusing to the Vorthaks was how desperately the humans seemed to believe in their doomed technology. Intercepted communications showed human scientists celebrating minor breakthroughs, like managing to teleport a ship 50 kilometers without it exploding immediately, or achieving a transportation that only killed half the crew instead of all of them. "They're like children playing with fusion cores," observed General Zektar, who commanded the Empire's bioweapon divisions. "Dangerous to themselves, harmless to us." The intelligence displays showed Earth's defensive preparations, pathetic arrays of kinetic weapons, chemical rockets that moved slower than Vorthak leisure craft, and energy shields that couldn't stop a Vorthak hunting spear, much less their military-grade plasma cannons. The humans had numbers, Admiral Kai admitted, but numbers meant nothing when facing superior technology and strategy. Their fleet compositions are interesting, noted the tactical analyst. They seem to be organizing around these quantum displacement vessels, despite their obvious failures. Perhaps they plan to use them as some sort of kamikaze weapon? This suggestion brought fresh waves of laughter. The idea that the humans would intentionally destroy their own ships as a tactical maneuver was so bizarre that even the battle-hardened Vorthak commanders found it hilarious. Emperor Vextar raised one clawed hand and silence fell instantly. Begin the invasion immediately. I want their homeworld's resources cataloged and their population processed within 2 months, and ensure our chroniclers record their quantum displacement attempts. Future generations of Vorthaks will enjoy laughing at their final, desperate gambit. The War Council dispersed with cruel anticipation, none of them suspecting that they had just made the biggest mistake in Vorthak history. 3 months had passed since the Vorthak invasion began, and to any outside observer, it looked like humanity was losing badly. Really badly. The pattern was always the same. Vorthak bioships would arrive at a human colony, their organic hulls pulsing with deadly energy. The local human defense fleet would scramble to meet them, engaging in what looked like desperate battles above peaceful farming worlds and mining stations. Laser fire would light up the darkness of space, missiles would streak between the fleets, and for a few hours it might even look like the humans had a chance. But then, inevitably, the human ships would begin their retreat. Not a panicked rout, but an organized withdrawal that left the Vorthaks scratching their scaled heads. The humans would fight just long enough to make it look good, then pull back to the next system, leaving their colonies to be conquered. Admiral Kai was starting to find the pattern almost boring. His third fleet had taken 17 human worlds, without breaking a sweat. Each victory felt hollow because the humans barely seemed to be trying. Sure, they put up resistance, but it was like fighting children. They had spirit but no real skill or technology to back it up. Sir, we've received surrender transmissions from the Kepler colony, reported his communications officer during their latest conquest. They're requesting terms for civilian evacuation. Kai waved a dismissive claw. Standard protocol. Process the useful ones for labor assignments, terminate the rest. How many human vessels escaped this time? Approximately 60% of their defensive fleet, sir. They followed the same pattern, engage for 2 hours, then retreat to the Ross system. This was what puzzled Kai most. Why did the humans keep running? Their losses weren't even that severe. If they had stayed and fought properly, they might have actually damaged some Vorthak ships. Instead, they seemed content to trade space for time, falling back system after system in what looked like a fighting retreat toward their homeworld. Deep in the Ross system, aboard the human cruiser Defiance, Captain Lee Jun was having a very different conversation with his bridge crew. The ship's conference room was cramped and utilitarian, nothing like the crystal palaces the Vorthaks used for their meetings. But the humans gathered around the metal table were far from defeated. Vorthak 3rd Fleet just took Kepler, reported Commander Park Min, studying the tactical displays. Right on schedule, they're getting cocky. Their formation discipline is getting sloppy. Good, June nodded, his weathered face showing satisfaction rather than concern. What about their communication patterns? We've cracked about 70% of their tactical frequencies, said Lieutenant Kim Hana from the intelligence station. Their command structure is exactly what our simulations predicted. Very hierarchical, very rigid. When we cut off their command ships, the rest won't know what to do. An older woman in civilian clothes leaned forward from the back of the room. Dr. Song Ji had been working around the clock for months, and the exhaustion showed in her eyes. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and confident. The quantum displacement drives are ready, she announced. All 400 ships in the Sol Defense Fleet are now equipped with the real technology, not the fake versions we've been letting the Vorthaks see. The room fell silent for a moment. Every person there understood what this meant. For the past year, while Vorthak spies watched human quantum displacement tests end in spectacular failures, the real research had been happening in hidden facilities scattered across dozens of star systems. Every exploding test ship, every accident, every dead crew, it had all been an elaborate performance. The actual breakthrough had come 8 months ago, when Dr. Song's team realized they were approaching the problem all wrong. Instead of trying to move matter through normal space, they had learned to slip ships briefly into quantum foam, the strange empty space between dimensions where the normal rules of physics didn't apply. The Vorthaks think our quantum drives are weapons of mass suicide, June said, allowing himself a small smile. They have no idea that every failed test was actually us learning how to coordinate mass teleportation attacks. Commander Park pulled up a star chart showing Vorthak fleet positions. Red symbols marked enemy forces spread across 24 systems, all advancing toward Earth in a pattern that looked unstoppable. They're positioning exactly where our war games predicted. Overconfident, spread out, and completely unprepared for what's coming. The genius of the human plan wasn't just the technology, it was the psychology. By appearing weak and desperate, by retreating just far enough to look beaten but not far enough to look strategic, they had lured the entire Vorthak Third Fleet into the perfect trap. Their reinforcements arrived yesterday, reported the intelligence officer. Elements from their 5th and 7th fleets. Total enemy strength is now just over 3,000 vessels, all concentrated in the outer Sol system, exactly where we want them. Dr. Song activated a holographic display showing the solar system. Earth sat at the center looking vulnerable and alone. Arranged around it in seemingly defensive positions were the 400 ships of humanity's last stand fleet. What the Vorthaks couldn't see were the quantum displacement coordinates already programmed into every human ship. What looked like a desperate defensive formation was actually a carefully planned attack pattern that would let them strike from every direction at once. "When do we spring the trap?" asked Captain Lee. "Tomorrow," Dr. Song replied. "The Vorthaks will arrive expecting to crush humanity's final defense. Instead, they're going to learn what real quantum displacement looks like." The morning sun barely peeked through the gray clouds when the first workers gathered at the factory gates. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhoods. Today was the day they would make their stand. Nobody wanted this fight, but sometimes fighting is the only choice left when your back is against the wall. The night shift workers stayed past their usual time, joining hands with the day shift as they arrived. Old friendships and new alliances formed in those crucial moments. People who had barely spoken before found themselves side by side, united by a common cause that was bigger than any personal differences. The factory owner arrived in his expensive car around 9 in the morning, expecting another normal day of business as usual. Instead, he found his gates blocked by a sea of determined faces. These weren't angry mobs or violent protesters. They were ordinary people who had simply reached their breaking point. The strike began peacefully. Workers sat in circles, sharing stories about their struggles to pay rent and buy groceries on wages that hadn't increased in years. Mothers talked about choosing between medicine for their children and putting food on the table. Fathers spoke quietly about the shame of not being able to provide for their families despite working 60-hour weeks. Local news crews arrived by midday, their cameras capturing images that would soon spread across the city. The workers had prepared for this moment. They held handmade signs with simple messages that anyone could understand. "Fair wages for fair work," and "We just want to survive," became the rallying cries that echoed through the streets. The strike wasn't just about money, though money was certainly part of it. Years of ignored safety concerns had created dangerous working conditions. Broken machinery that should have been replaced continued to operate, putting workers at risk every single day. Requests for basic protective equipment were met with excuses about tight budgets, while company executives received generous bonuses. As word of the strike spread, something unexpected began to happen. Other workers from different industries started showing up at the factory gates. Construction workers still covered in dust from their job sites. Restaurant servers who had finished their morning shifts. Even some office workers who used their lunch breaks to stand in solidarity. The community support grew stronger as the hours passed. Local shop owners brought free coffee and sandwiches to the striking workers. Churches opened their doors as meeting places where strategies could be discussed and spirits could be lifted. Children drew pictures of support that were taped to the factory fence, creating a colorful display of hope. The factory management tried different tactics to break the strike. They first attempted to bring in replacement workers, but the solidarity was too strong. Most potential replacements refused to cross the picket line after talking with the striking workers. Some management representatives tried to negotiate with individual workers, offering small personal benefits to return to work, but these attempts largely failed. By the third day, the economic impact became impossible to ignore. The factory's production had completely stopped, and orders were backing up. Customers began calling, asking about delayed shipments. The company's reputation started to suffer as news of the working conditions became public knowledge. The strike also revealed the true character of the community. Some people discovered leadership abilities they never knew they possessed. Quiet individuals found their voices and became powerful speakers for the cause. Others showed remarkable organizational skills, coordinating food distribution and communication networks. Not everyone supported the strike, of course. Some community members worried about the economic impact on local businesses. A few workers who lived paycheck to paycheck couldn't afford to miss work and reluctantly crossed the picket line, creating difficult situations for everyone involved. The weather added another challenge to the situation. Rain soaked the protesters on the fourth day, but they remained at their posts under makeshift shelters. The sight of dedicated workers standing firm despite the uncomfortable conditions gained even more public sympathy. Social media played a crucial role in spreading awareness beyond the local community. Photos and videos of the peaceful protest reached people in distant cities, inspiring similar movements elsewhere. The local strike had become part of a larger conversation about worker rights and economic inequality. As the strike entered its second week, both sides began to feel the pressure more intensely. Workers were struggling financially without their paychecks, relying on community support and personal savings that were quickly running out. The company faced mounting losses and increasing pressure from customers and investors. The turning point came when a major customer threatened to cancel a significant contract unless the labor dispute was resolved quickly. This external pressure finally forced management to consider serious negotiations rather than simply waiting for the workers to give up. The strike had transformed from a workplace dispute into a community movement that would be remembered for years to come. Regardless of how it ended, the workers had already achieved something important. They had found their collective voice and shown that ordinary people could stand up for themselves when they worked together. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the final showdown. 2 weeks of striking had pushed everyone to their limits. Workers had emptied their savings accounts while the company watched millions of dollars slip away each day. The factory remained silent. The negotiation table was set up in the community center, neutral ground where neither side held an advantage. Local religious leaders and community elders served as mediators, their presence lending gravity to the proceedings. This wasn't just about one factory anymore. The entire town was watching, knowing that whatever happened here would shape their future. The company executives arrived first, dressed in their expensive suits and carrying thick folders of legal documents. They looked tired and stressed, a far cry from their usual confident demeanor. The pressure from shareholders and major clients had clearly taken its toll. Behind their professional facades, you could see the worry lines that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. The worker representatives came in looking determined but worn down. These were people who had never imagined they'd be sitting across from corporate executives negotiating the terms of their own survival. Some clutched handwritten notes while others relied on the collective strength of their group to find the right words when the moment came. The first few hours of negotiations were rocky. Both sides started with positions that were miles apart. The company offered minimal wage increases and vague promises about safety improvements. The workers demanded substantial raises and binding commitments to workplace safety standards. It seemed like they might be heading for another deadlock. But something had changed during those 2 weeks of striking. The workers had discovered their own power, and the company had learned they couldn't simply ignore their employees' concerns. The balance of power had shifted in ways that surprised everyone involved. The breakthrough came when one of the older workers stood up and began speaking from the heart. She talked about her 30 years at the factory, watching it grow and prosper while the workers who made that success possible fell further behind. Her words weren't angry or demanding. They were simply honest. She described the reality of trying to raise grandchildren on wages that hadn't kept pace with the cost of living. Her testimony seemed to crack something open in the room. One of the company executives, perhaps thinking of his own family, began asking genuine questions about the workers' situations. This led to real conversations instead of formal position statements. People started talking to each other as human beings rather than adversaries. The safety issues proved to be easier to resolve than anyone expected. When the company lawyers reviewed the workers' documented concerns, they realized the potential liability was enormous. Fixing the broken equipment and improving safety protocols would actually save money in the long run by preventing accidents and insurance claims. The wage negotiations were more complex. The company genuinely couldn't afford everything the workers wanted immediately, but they could commit to a structured plan for improvements over time. The workers, understanding the economic realities, were willing to accept gradual progress as long as it was guaranteed and measurable. As the sun set on the negotiation day, both sides were exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The final agreement included immediate wage increases of 15%, with additional raises tied to company performance over the next 3 years. Safety improvements would begin within 30 days, with a joint worker management committee overseeing the process. But the most important change wasn't written in any contract. The strike had forced both sides to see each other as real people with legitimate concerns. The workers had proven they could organize and stand up for themselves. The management had learned that ignoring employee concerns was not just morally wrong but also bad for business. The announcement of the agreement brought mixed reactions from the community. Most people celebrated the resolution and the improvements it would bring to workers' lives. However, some worried about the precedent it might set for other workplaces in the area. Business owners wondered if their own employees might be inspired to make similar demands. The return to work wasn't seamless. There were awkward moments as people readjusted to working together after weeks of conflict. Some relationships had been strained by the strike, while others had been strengthened. The workplace dynamics had permanently changed in ways that would take time to fully understand. The workers who had emerged as leaders during the strike found themselves in new roles within the factory. Their colleagues looked to them for guidance and representation in ongoing discussions with management. This shift in workplace culture was perhaps more significant than the wage increases themselves. In the weeks that followed, other factories in the region began improving their own working conditions, hoping to avoid similar labor disputes. The strike had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the original workplace, demonstrating how collective action could influence an entire industry. The reckoning had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, fairness, and human dignity in the workplace. While the immediate crisis was resolved, the deeper questions it raised would continue to shape conversations about work and workers' rights for years to come. The factory whistle blew at 7 in the morning, just like it had for decades, but everything else had changed. Workers walking through the gates carried themselves differently now. There was a new confidence in their steps, a sense that their voices actually mattered. The strike was over, but its effects were just beginning to reshape how business was done. The first major change was visible immediately. New safety equipment arrived within days of the agreement being signed. Hard hats that actually fit properly, safety goggles that weren't cracked, and protective gear that met current standards rather than outdated requirements from 20 years ago. Workers who had grown used to making do with broken equipment suddenly found themselves with tools that actually worked. The Joint Safety Committee held its first meeting in the factory's conference room, a space where workers had never been invited before. Sitting around the polished table, employees and managers reviewed accident reports and discussed prevention strategies as equals. The shift from us versus them to we was awkward at first, but gradually became more natural. Production resumed slowly as everyone adjusted to the new reality. Some of the replacement equipment required training, which the company provided without the usual complaints about lost productivity. Managers who had previously dismissed worker suggestions about efficiency improvements now found themselves taking notes and implementing ideas that had been ignored for years. The wage increases made an immediate difference in the community. Local businesses noticed more customers as workers had extra money to spend. The grocery store expanded its hours to accommodate the increased traffic. Restaurants that had struggled during the strike suddenly found themselves busy again. The economic ripple effect spread through the town like circles in a pond. But money wasn't the only thing that had changed. The workers had tasted something more valuable than higher wages. They had discovered their own power. Regular meetings were scheduled where employees could voice concerns before they became major problems. This early warning system prevented several potential conflicts that might have escalated under the old system. The company executives, initially resistant to these changes, began to see unexpected benefits. Employee turnover dropped significantly as workers felt more valued and heard. The constant recruiting and training of new employees had been expensive, so the improved retention actually saved money. Productivity increased as people took more pride in their work when they felt respected. Not all the changes went smoothly. Some of the old guard managers struggled to adapt to the new collaborative approach. They had built their careers on top-down authority and found it difficult to treat workers as partners rather than subordinates. A few chose to leave the company rather than change their management style. Similarly, some workers had trouble adjusting to their new responsibilities. Being heard meant being accountable for their suggestions and input. The freedom to speak up came with the expectation that they would contribute constructively rather than just complain. This transition challenged everyone to grow in unexpected ways. The worker representatives who had emerged during the strike found themselves in an interesting position. They weren't union officials, but they weren't regular employees anymore either. They became bridges between the workforce and management, translating concerns and facilitating communication. This new role required skills that none of them had possessed before the strike. Other companies in the region watched these developments with interest and concern. Some proactively improved their own working conditions, hoping to avoid similar labor disputes. Others dug in their heels, convinced that giving in to worker demands would set a dangerous precedent. The industry was splitting into two camps with very different philosophies about employee relations. The media attention gradually faded, but the lessons learned during the strike continued to influence daily operations. Decisions that would have been made unilaterally by management were now discussed with worker input. This slowed down some processes, but prevented costly mistakes that came from ignoring the practical knowledge of people who actually did the work. Training programs were expanded beyond basic job skills to include leadership development and communication techniques. The company realized that their workforce contained untapped potential that could benefit everyone if properly developed. Workers who had never seen themselves as leaders began taking on greater responsibilities. The transformation wasn't limited to the workplace. The solidarity and organizational skills developed during the strike carried over into community activities. The same people who had coordinated food distribution and communication networks during the labor dispute began applying those abilities to local issues like school funding and infrastructure improvements. 6 months after the strike ended, a visitor to the factory would have noticed something intangible but unmistakable. The atmosphere had changed. People worked with more energy and enthusiasm. Conversations between different levels of employees were more frequent and natural. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined every interaction had softened into something more flexible and human. The new order wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't permanent. Maintaining these improvements required constant effort from everyone involved. But for the first time in years, both workers and management felt like they were moving in the same direction, rather than pulling against each other. The strike had ended, but the real work of building a better workplace was just beginning.